Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the ID5 podcast. Today, I'm very happy to receive Jess Simpson from Publicis Group. Jess, welcome to the ID5 podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So Jess is our first agency side or buy side guest. So there'll be a slightly different tone for the discussion and a slightly different focus. And she's also based in Atlanta, which is a very dear to my heart place. It brings back fun memories. How's life in Atlanta, Jess, these days?
It's very hot. It's like 99 degrees today.
That I remember as well. Not the best part of the world at that time of the year, but anyway. All right, great. So let's just jump straight into the discussion, and we usually ask our guests as an introductory question. There's no question about the growth of digital advertising, right? You look past past 20 years, it's really taken over most other medias as being the go-to destination for brands' advertising budget. But the question is it sustainable? Can we continue to see that growth going forward? And how are we doing everything we need to kind of grow in a sustainable manner?
Yeah, I think this answer really depends on the lens by which you're looking, but I think I would say my inclination is to respond to this by saying yes. So, the vast majority of us are certainly trying to put our best foot forward to make sure that it is growing sustainably. I think we're going through a lot of disruption right now, which tends to be the precursor to transformation. And so what's really interesting is that I think a lot of the walled gardens have historically gotten a bad rap for not being very easy to work with. And what I've noticed is that a lot of them are really opening their doors to collaboration, which historically hasn't been the case, which I'm sure is to protect their own commercial interests. But I do also try to convince myself that it is also to protect the best interest of the publishers and advertisers that they serve as well. So, in terms of sustainability, the solutions that are being built might not be the simplest to understand right now or execute, but I don't think that means that they aren't sustainable. And so I do think that, even though Facebook has announced that some of the growth that they've seen might decline, and some folks are concerned with some of Apple's announcements, we do work with some of the smartest folks in the industry. And I think innovation is right at the cusp of chaos. And I think we're there. I think what we're lacking right now is aggregation of that innovation and standards against that. And once we have that, I think we're going to be in a much better place because the fragmentation is a lot to bear. And if we can consolidate the fragmentation and get that aggregation of innovation at an industry level, I think it's going to be quite sustainable.
Okay, but that if I translate that into maybe a bit of a provocative statement, what you're saying is that we're going to become more sustainable because it's going to be simpler, more consolidated around the big walled gardens, which maybe from a walled garden standpoint sounds sustainable. What about the rest of the world? What about the open web? What about publishers? As you mentioned, okay, you're saying the walled gardens are positioning themselves in a way that is hopefully supportive of the open web. Is this really is this the way forward, you think? Are we looking at a future where kind of publishers and brands kind of meet through the lens of Apple, Google, Facebook? Is this what you're see as a sustainable future?
Yeah, so I actually think that there's going to be a paradigm shift more to the consumer, which actually takes more onus away from the companies themselves, including the walled gardens, which is a very future state focus, but it's something that organizations like the DPPA are focused on. So it's the concepts of sovereign identity and decentralized identity, and concepts that the W3C are kind of thinking around, where you have, sort of like this trifecta of identity verification, and the consumers become their own chief digital officer. Mm-hmm. And so it's really less about, how you're transacting against data and more how you're transacting against consent. And so it's how you're starting to see the internet of value pop up. And the Brave internet and Neva, and how things are starting to correspond to rewards and utility around consumers getting paid for their own personal identifiable information, either by way of NFTs or by monetary compensation. And so I think you're starting to move in that direction, which is going to be extraordinarily disruptive for the large walled gardens, and it's going to force them into a position of extensibility and interoperability to be more compliant with the open web. Now, I think that when you think about the solutions that are in market today, that are very focused on cookie replacement solutions, that are using hard signals like hashed email, I think those are fundamentally acceptable right now, but I think those could be met with some challenges in the future, which is why I think that there's a misconception that, for instance, like Epsilon, they're not rooted in hashed email, they're rooted in offline PII. And so there's a lot of misconceptions in the marketplace that, some of these identity solutions aren't going to last. And that's not true. They're solving for what's in the market today, but they're ready to evolve for tomorrow. So I guess, is your question, will the walled gardens open up and work with the open web in the future? I think the answer is yes, but not in the way that the solutions are architected and prototyped today. It's going to be more of the privacy intersect clean room to clean room models. It's going to be more of the sovereign identity and decentralized identity solutions whereby the consumer is in control. So the concept of, data unions, it's not going to be the way that we're thinking about today, or some of the publisher driven solutions, which are done through, first party data co-ops that are sort of supported by, internet clean room type of infrastructures. It's not going to be like the federated email solutions, at least I don't think, but again, what do I know, that are in market today.
Well, that's a lot to unpack already, but I agree with you that we're going through a transition, and like that the technical method that we're implementing right now are going to evolve.
And again, that's not to say that that's not going to work today, so that's not to say don't use what's in market today. It's just things are going to change,
Yeah, and I'd like to get back to the initial statement that you made at the beginning of your answer around the consumer kind of owning more of that relationship directly, which to me is related to the value exchange, right? Like consumers, I mean, them being paid or having access to free content services, or like there has to be a value exchange for them to accept the engagement and the relationship that brands and publishers want to have with them, right? And I think that value exchange has been very implicit historically, just because it was there, and we didn't need to spend time to explain the value exchange. But now it's becoming a lot more obvious. It's becoming a lot more explicit. In Europe, you have to ask for permission, you have to ask for consent, and I think going forward we're going to see a lot more of that discussion. I think we're getting there with publishers who are kind of in many occasions, at least from an advertising standpoint, the natural kind of contact person for consumers. But I'm curious about brand, and I'm sure you're talking to brands every day. How are they looking at this value exchange? Are they ready to engage in this value exchange? Are they ready to ask for permission? Are they ready to extend basically what is their CRM practices to their advertising practices? How do you rate them in that transition, in that kind of creation of an explicit value exchange with consumers?
Yeah, I think it's hard. So it's hard to blanket all of them into a grouping. I think all of them understand the concept generally, but I think what everyone tends to do, and this is just, human nature, is for us to sort of overcompensate and kind of what I say is we all just want to be a little extra. Like, I think we have gotten into a mindset where we need everything all at once. And I think what we're going to have to do is sort of like build our empire over time and build these profiles over time. And so it's really about not just creating like fragmented experiences, but creating holistic experiences. But you've got to focus on your customers, your consumers first. So when you think about the value map, right? And everyone has kind of always done this traditionally from like a product perspective. So when you think about the product organizations, and they've always mapped out, the value canvas of how do I get people to buy my product? How do I get people to pay more for my product? I think now you're going to start doing that when you think about consent and opt-in, like, how do I get people to give me their information? And how do I get people to give me more of their information and continuously give me their information across multiple touch points? I think that same approach to the product evolution becomes applicable to the consent optimization framework. And you're starting to see more consent management platforms actually capitalize on that optimization. And CDPs say that they do that. I truly haven't seen a CDP that actually does that, but and I think brands are slowly getting on board with that, because it's really sort of a blend of creative strategy and data strategy and tech strategy all
Yeah.
brought together. And so it's,
Product strategy, right? That
yeah, it's
service
a
strategy. Yeah,
very
absolutely.
new way of thinking that we haven't really had to think about before. And so I think you have to kind of scale back and think like, how, instead of like getting it all brought into my ecosystem and then cleaning it up later, it's really about like, let's just get what we need now and make sure it's clean and like exactly what we need, and start building it slowly and like pragmatically over time, with real utility in mind, which is just a very different mindset than what we have before. And has anyone been nailing it? It's so new that like I'm not really sure you can like start grading that, but I think there are brands that are far more leaned into it than others,
Any types of brand that come to mind? People that are in the e-commerce space, maybe retail, people that have a very strong kind of CRM culture, more so. Yeah, probably.
Yeah, but interestingly enough, CPGs are really starting to think about, because CPGs have been really reliant on third-party data, and they're like, well, shucks, like how am I gonna survive and thrive in this ecosystem? I don't want to be super reliant on like the Googles and the Facebooks of the world, and have to just completely fall into a second-party data marketplace or retail media networks that I might, not be able to see through the feedback loop. So I think they're really leaning into like what we call first party data playbooks and lookbooks, and how to think about experiential marketing in a more scientific way that incorporates data architecture and technology and measurement. And so, but yes, for sure, like retail and auto, and a little bit of finance, but folks who have telco, folks who have a lot of first party data, of course, folks who have a lot of data science, right? So data engineers who can kind of back that up. But what we're
and
finding,
that culture as well, right? Yeah.
The hardest teams to staff for right now, and the teams that are most in demand, are those data engineers and data science teams that can kind of take this and turn it into something that is really actionable.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's like we've been through like different phases, right? Like pre 2005 or 2010, advertising was really a kind of broadcast message to as many people as you can reach, and try to I'm oversimplifying obviously, but like really almost a data-less experience in terms of activation. And then we went through a phase of like using everything and ingesting everything, and like a bit of a data fest almost, right? And now there's kind of a balance, right? It's like useful data only, meaningful data only, because less of it is available anyway, and so we have to be a bit more strategic about how we're looking at data from a brand standpoint. Is that a fair summary?
I mean, it is. And I think about it in terms of like someone gave me this analogy. I don't remember where I heard it, but it was like in terms of nutrition, it's like not all carbs are bad. Like, and you know, like not all data is bad, not all targeting is bad, not all tracking is bad. Like there's a balance to everything.
Mm.
And so I think to say that you can just go all in on like contextual or like mass roadblock takeovers for creative and that's going to work for you. I mean, that's just silly to say. Like there's an element of one-to-one personalization that it works. Otherwise, you know, what have we been doing for the last 10 or 15 years? And so, you know,
Yeah, I mean, and what have we been doing for forever in just like, you know, welcoming people that come into a store by saying, hello, sir, hello, madam, right? Like that's that's basic personalization, right? So just an extension of that, yeah.
Or like when you go to interviews and you're like, you know, don't like people always coach you like don't compliment anyone on like their pictures, but like find something more benign to compliment them on. Like you want to personalize and be relatable to like the person on the other end. So yeah, I mean, there's an aspect just relationally that you want to build, but you know, I do think that's why when we think about identity, we think about it in terms of like a pyramid schema where there's a trade-off of accuracy versus scale. And so at the top of that, that's why I was saying earlier, there's absolutely a place for like the federated email solutions, like the core IDs and the ATS and, you know, UID2. We partner with all of those guys because actually in people, you know, people automatically think, oh, well, you're part of Publicis Group, so like you default to Epsilon. Well, yes, of course, you know, we think Epsilon's a great solution, but we actually also work with Newstar and LiveRamp, and we have a wonderful relationship with the Trade Desk. And so we use all of those solutions across clients, as well as, you know, the Verizon ID solution. But really on a good day, you know, when you scale across that, are you going to reach 20 or 30% of that? And so what we're seeing is a lot of contextual solutions come out from like Amazon and Epsilon and all of those guys who are taking authenticated users and building out contextual solutions on that so that they can do, they're like Epsilon calls it like a limited identity solution, because they know that as premiums go up on those users for addressability, which is a huge point, even if you could reach all of them, the premiums are going to go up on them. There's going to be a trade-off. And so we really do think about it as a pyramid. You've got the addressability at the top, but you might only have a scale of or reach of like 20 or 30%. And then as you get to the middle of that, that's where you really have to lean in on like your publisher driven solutions. So, you know, the ID5 solutions, the second party data marketplace solutions, a lot of the AI solutions where you're using attributes appended to your first party data, whether that is your first party PII or your campaign data to fuel custom algos, advanced targeting. You know, Google is pioneering a lot of that, which they're not getting a lot of credit for. And I think it's important to remember, like their ad team, very different than Chrome. And then it's church and state.
I think it's been very, very obvious over the past few months, right?
I mean, seriously, but some people still don't get that. And I'm like, you know, I got to give my girl, Kate, who's like our ad team lead, like poor lady, you know, I got to give them some credit. Like they're doing the best they can. But then, you know, you keep kind of going down and then you've got your flocks and your cohorts and your, you know, your Microsoft parakeets and those types of solutions. And so here you've got your scale, here you've got your like, or here you've got your accuracy, down here you've got your scale, and there's like contextual down here and, you know, one-to-one here. And so each brand is going to have their own identity pyramid and their own identity schema, and it's going to look different for everybody. And it's really important to find an agency partner that can tailor that to you, that understands the dynamics and intricacies globally of how that looks different, because some of these solutions, they don't work in EMEA. Most of them don't work in LATAM and APAC. And so if you're a global brand, you know, you really need to have an agency partner that understands that and isn't just like, all you have is contextual flock and ATS. Like that, if your agency is telling you that, red flag.
Change agency. So I'm curious of how, I mean, you're talking to brands about those things and trying to make sense of that complexity for brands every day. How are they receiving it? Are they engaged? Are they kind of completely lost, overwhelmed? Because it is complicated, right? And we're trying to migrate from like a, you know, somewhat simple world to a and hopefully better, more kind of user kind of engaged, consented, privacy safe, you know, maybe even scalable, because, you know, a lot can be said about the scale of cookie-based solutions. But that migration is painful. There's a lot of initiatives, there's a lot of innovation, there's a lot of buzzwords, and there's a lot of BS. And so how are they looking at that transition? Do they understand it? Do they care? Are they lost? Are they like, I don't know. I'm not talking to brands. So how tough is your job right now?
I mean, pick a day. You know, it just depends. Like some of them get it. But they're like frustrated. You know, everyone's frustrated because it's one more thing. You have to remember, a lot of us are still parents and we're still in the middle of a pandemic, and now we're hitting another wave. And it's like, are kids going to go to school in person? You know, so we're dealing with all that over here. And then you got all this going on over here with work. And so I think we all have to take a step back and remember, like, we're human beings who are trying to do a job with kids at home or parents who might be sick. And like, so I don't know. I just try to like remember that like we're all somebody's like spouse or child or like parent first and foremost. But yeah, I mean, people are struggling because it's like we're all working from home. We're all trying to figure out just how to get through the day. And this is hard because most of these people are like trained media planners and buyers who are not trained to evaluate CDP technology or understand the audit trail for homomorphic encryption and like privacy intersect models. You know, I mean, this is not what they signed up for. And so it is a extraordinary amount of education. And one of the things that my bosses tell me all the time is just like, you like to get into the weeds, like you want to talk to, you know, people like you, Matt, and, you know,
but nobody else does.
yeah, like the CTO at InfoSum. Like if I could get the CTO at InfoSum on the phone, like Nick, and talk to him for like 4 hours, or like Steve Silvers at Newstar. I mean, I would. Nobody else wants to talk about that stuff. Like they want high level, you know. And so I think the hardest part of my job is to try to take the nuances and simplify it in a way that helps them kind of navigate it in terms of like, you know, what's now, what's next, and then like what's future state. So like but you know, they're all I think they're all doing the best they can. And they're all really, for the most part, leaned into education. I think some of them have maybe cooled off a little bit on like on some testing opportunities, because in fairness, a lot of solutions in the market are a little immature and kind of smoke and mirrors, and there's a lot of posturing. And so for us, right, we can peel back that onion and be like, this is baloney, right? Like this isn't, there's nothing to test. Like this technology is still very much predicated on cookies. Like, what are you selling me here? But for an average media planner or buyer or marketer, like they don't know that. And so they're like, you're selling me a unicorn, and this thing is like this is like a goat, you know? And so it's like there's a lot of frustration. But I think generally speaking, very, very many of them are in the education phase, and we're all trying to kind of move them to that like design and implementation phase, so they don't cool their heels too much. And then when things really start moving, you know, in 6 months, they're like, oh crap, like now we have to scurry again, you know?
Yeah. And hopefully the next 18 months, kind of the delay that we have with, you know, Google pushing back the date to kind of deprecate third-party cookies in Chrome, hopefully that's going to help some of that smoke and mirrors, right? Some of that dust settle, and like, okay, now we're going to see who's for real, because, you could put together a sexy PowerPoint deck, in Q2 of this year in preparation for, Q4 and get away with it. But if you don't properly invest on your infrastructure, on your product, on your value proposition, your messaging, you're not going to last the next 18 months. And we'll be able to differentiate who's for real and who's not, right? And I think that's really something that, at least we're looking forward to.
Well, and that's why I keep saying to everyone, I'm like, okay, show me.
Yeah.
Show me. And if they don't show me, I'm like, okay, this meeting's over, like.
Okay, let's get back to that complexity, because I think, when you think about, what's made the success of Google and Facebook, by and large, it's the simplicity, right? It's the one-stop shop, the, openness to, like, millions of advertisers. Like, how much do we need to work on simplicity, on simplifying things as an industry, right? And specifically outside of the walled gardens, to make sure that we are a sustainable destination for brands' investments? Like, how would you? Yeah, what do we need to simplify? I guess measurement, right, seems like an obvious one. Identity is still work in progress, but hopefully we'll get to a simpler state eventually. Cross-platform consistency. What do you think is particularly complicated right now in the world outside of Google and Facebook, that could solve to make the value proposition for brands more appealing and more simple, and therefore more sustainable?
So it's interesting because I don't even think you can simplify measurement yet. I think you have to define it. When you think about measurement, like we've just been talking about it in terms of like a 3D approach, because I don't think anyone has measurement figured out yet. Like, I think we kind of know that we can do cross publisher with some of the solutions in place. And I think we know that like MMM is going to work and incrementality is going to work. And, you're going to be able to do statistical modeling across multiple clean rooms to sort of tie in some of these gaps. But, measurement is a big question mark for a lot of companies right now. Like, how are they going to approach that? So simplifying that seems like a secondary step to just figuring out
Just defining it.
how to approach it and define it, because
Yeah.
I'm not sure that many folks have really figured out the omni-channel, cross-platform, cross-device approach. And that's something we're really digging into, because if, when people tell me I've got MTA figured out, I'm like, do you? Good
Show
for
me.
you. Show me. Yeah. Please give me your wisdom.
Yeah.
We're trying to figure it out, but I'm not going to lie to someone and say I've got it all figured out yet, because it's very hard without cookies. You can do some level of extrapolation on authenticated users, but you can do it based off of panels, but it's not the same. It's not how it was. I think the targeting piece, you can get away with. Like, I think AI is going to be it. Like, AI is probably going to power a lot of the campaign functions across targeting and across measurement, but that's not necessarily simplifying it for, media folks. So in terms of how you simplify it for them, I'm not sure, because I'm not sure if this next iteration of our industry is going to be simple. I think, like I said, I just go back to, you have to consolidate. Like, there's too much fragmentation. So when I look at some of the material that my team has produced, just in the authenticated solution space, there's like 30 different solutions. In the unauthenticated identity space, there's like 30. That's too many. Like, you can't test that. So there has to be some consolidation. In terms of simplification, yeah, it's too complicated for like the average media planner to understand. So I guess, like, how do you up level that? But maybe it's less about simplification and more about standardization. And so I'm interested to see what the new appointment at the IAB is going to do. He's been pretty bold in his statements that he knows he's going to probably upset some people, but and we're part of all of the, the GARMs, the ANA, the 4As, but everyone's trying to standardize, but I think that has to be aggregated to one standard, right? Across like PRAM, IAB, GARM, 4As, ANA, like there has to be one standard. And typically if that standard doesn't work in EMEA, it's not going to work anywhere else. And so I would say like simplification probably comes with standardization would be my thought. And then like the innovation piece, I do think that there's going to have to be an evolution of and some level of adoption and reconciliation in the fact that like this concept of being able to use and I know we talked about this when you were presenting your solution to me, and I was kind of getting after you on that, and I was like, I just don't know the validity of using some of the hard and soft signals long term. I'm just not sure how long that's going to last. I think if it's a derivative of a first party site, like the first party cookies, the IP addresses, like some of those things that are originating from the first party site, I think you're okay for now, but it's a gray area. So it's just, you don't know where regulations are going to take you. Which is why I think that the innovations around, the clean room to clean room state and some of those types of solutions that can facilitate measurement and activation are pretty interesting to me.
Yeah, and I mean we're going through this phase, which is necessarily like first broader, and then kind of we'll see a reduction of options, because as you say, some of them will be relevant, some others won't, some will be consolidated, and there will be I mean our strong belief is that there will be a market dynamic that will lead towards a certain direction, a certain kind of set of players, set of ways of doing things. But it has to be market driven. It's very difficult to say, okay, from now on, like we're deciding to go that way. No one has the authority or the means, right? And so it has to be a collective effort, which makes it even more difficult because there's so many options, there's so many kind of ways of looking at this, there's so many priorities, geographies, right? That it's a difficult market to standardize.
Which is why I think that until there's some sort of, and I think the global legislation gets trickier, which is, that's a more difficult conversation, but this lack of federal legislation, it makes things ridiculously difficult in the States. It's too piecemeal. So.
Yeah, and that's kind of to an even kind of higher level when you think about it on a global scale. As you said, a lot of the solutions that are being rolled out in the US aren't even kind of EMEA proof, and so from a global brand standpoint, it creates another level of complexity, right? Let alone right between California and Virginia and like the rest of the US, but also between North America and Europe and APAC and LATAM. I think I'm interested to get your point on this, and then I think we'll get to the end of the podcast. Otherwise, we could be there for 4 hours. How are you looking at privacy in terms of the principles, right? Because there's almost right. I mean, we're seeing two not necessarily two philosophies, but at least two understandings from a lot of folks in the US are associating authentication with consent. Like I give my email to a site, and so by default I agree to be tracked, day and night, right? While if you look at it from a GDPR standpoint, certainly like most regulation standpoint, it's about transparency and consent, irrespective of how you're getting, the technical implementation that kind of allow you to execute on that transparent, consented relationship. How are you looking at this? I mean, we're a bit into the fine prints here, but I think that's an interesting debate because a lot of folks have made that simplification, right?
Oh, how do I answer this question? So there's a couple of different ways that I can answer this, and I might not answer your question, but I think these are important points to kind of bring to the surface. So I think there's a couple of things here, right? The first is, and I heard this statement from a guy at Criteo, and he was like, the original sin of the internet is that everyone thought it was free. It's not. And that tracking is going away. It's not. It's just who gets to track you, right?
Yep.
And so I think there is a couple different things. There's the difference of informed consent and affirmative consent. And my belief is that if you authenticate to log into a website because you want to read a newspaper, but the T's and C's are not indicating that that authentication is going to lead to a marketing use case, that's not really affirmative consent. So, you know, I take I suppose maybe a more conservative approach, but that's not federal legislation right now. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So like my approach isn't law. So
Yeah.
therefore, like I am not in the position to give any legal advice. And I tell my clients all the time, like, you can go and use the most stringent regulations as your standard, but that's really between you and your legal team, how you want to handle that. Because it's really for every client to decide like how they want to function. I think the challenge of what's happening is there is a lot of privacy washing going on where you have private companies who are setting regulations in the absence of actual law, but they're really not anti-advertising because they're leading a push to shift the entire advertising stack to your actual device, which would effectively make them the only intermediaries, the effective intermediaries for targeting advertising, which is, you know, of course, completely anti in contact, you know,
Yeah.
in complete conflict with anti-competitive rhetoric. So
Yeah.
I think that, you know, in terms of like, do we need affirmative consent? The answer to that is yes. When you are authenticating with your email on a site to read a blog or a news article, and the T's and C's aren't saying when you do this, I also get to use your email to target you on the web. That's not affirmative consent to me, but the law doesn't say you have to do that. So, but also like as a consumer going to read those T's and C's 9 times out of 10, absolutely not, you know? So
Yeah, but I mean, if you look at it from a GDPR angle, right, you can say I agree to being identified and tracked for advertising purposes, but I don't want to give you my email address, or vice versa. I'm giving you my email address, but it's like the double opt-in in emails, right? Like
yeah,
you,
yeah.
you shouldn't use this for marketing. So I agree. There's an oversimplification there, and we need to come to. I'm sorry.
It's a tricky one.
It's a tricky one, but
Yeah.
hopefully the evolution in regulation will or in brand practices, because as you say, some brands are setting the bar very high and are saying like you need to prove this this level of interaction, this level of agreement from consumers, otherwise that piece of data isn't usable for me.
Yeah.
Well, Jess, thank you very much for your time. It was a really interesting conversation, and we did dive quite deep into the intricacies of the industry. And in 40 minutes, it's not a small feat. But yeah, I'm sure we could have gone a lot more. And you know, maybe we'll get you back for the second season of the podcast.
I hope so. This was great. Thank you so
This
much
was
for having me.
this was great. Thank you very much for joining, and to all of you listeners and watchers on Spotify and YouTube, thank you for your attention, and we'll see you next week.